The meteoric rise. It was a cold April morning in Bismarck, North Dakota. The sky was overcast, and a slight breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass over the football field. Carson Wentz stood at the 50-yard line, eyes fixed on the goalpost, envisioning a future no one around him could yet imagine. He wasn't the kind of high school athlete scouts drooled over. At 6 feet 5 inches, his frame was imposing, but his skills were still raw. Despite his impressive physical stature, Wentz wasn't the star recruit most quarterbacks from football-centric states like Texas or Florida were. But something was different about him. Something simmered beneath the surface, waiting to explode onto the national stage. Wentz's high school career ended quietly. No major scholarships, no parade of media attention. North Dakota State was his only option, and he grabbed it like a lifeline. It wasn't the glamorous path of powerhouse college programs, but for Wentz, it was a stepping stone. North Dakota State Bison football team had already made a name for itself in the FCS, but nobody knew that Wentz was about to elevate them to an entirely new level. As a backup for his first 2 years, Wentz was patient. He watched, he learned, and when his time came he was ready. By his senior year, Wentz's transformation was complete. He commanded the field with precision and poise, leading the Bison to another national championship. The stands roared with chants of his name as he broke the single-season passing record with over 3,100 yards and 32 total touchdowns. But as he stood atop the college football world, basking in the glow of his success, a dark cloud loomed on the horizon. Midway through his senior season, disaster struck. A wrist injury threatened to end everything he had worked for. His throwing hand, the very tool of his trade, was now compromised. Surgery was inevitable, and with it came the whispers. Would he ever return? Would he be the same quarterback who had electrified crowds with his deep throws and flawless footwork? Doubts swirled, but Wentz wasn't ready to fade into obscurity. He fought through rehab, pushing his body beyond its limits. The playoffs offered him a final shot at redemption, a chance to prove the injury hadn't stolen his dream. And he did exactly that. In a gutsy, triumphant return, Wentz led his team to another national title, his legacy now cemented as one of the greatest quarterbacks to ever play for North Dakota State. As the confetti fell around him, Wentz didn't see just another college victory. He saw the next chapter of his life opening. The NFL loomed large on the horizon, with scouts whispering his name in boardrooms across the country. His wrist may have healed, but the road ahead was far from smooth. It was littered with challenges, some he could never have foreseen. The day of the NFL draft arrived. It was 2016, and Wentz, once an overlooked kid from Bismarck, was now the name on everyone's lips. The Philadelphia Eagles, hungry for a franchise quarterback, moved heaven and earth to secure him with the second overall pick. The trade that sent shockwaves through the league showed just how much faith they had in him. Philadelphia had given up draft capital and future picks, betting their entire future on a kid from a small school who had never faced the likes of NFL defenses. In the quiet moments before his name was called, Wentz sat alone, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. His phone buzzed. "You ready to be an Eagle?" It was the call he'd been waiting for. His heart pounded in his chest as the voice on the other end welcomed him to Philadelphia. His rise had been meteoric, but the pressure that came with it was relentless. Walking across the stage, Wentz felt the weight of expectations settle heavily on his shoulders. The smiling commissioner handed him his new jersey, green, emblazoned with his name. It was a dream come true. But that dream was about to collide with a harsh reality. Football at this level was different. The stakes were higher, the hits harder, and the spotlight never faded. As Wentz donned the Eagles cap and raised his hands to the cheering crowd, he couldn't have known that in just a few short years, the same fans who adored him would turn on him. His career was about to take a turn that no one, especially Carson, could have predicted. Injuries, locker room conflicts, and leadership questions were already brewing beneath the surface, waiting to explode. But for now, in this moment, he was a hero. The peak of glory. The 2016 NFL season was a whirlwind for Carson Wentz. From the moment he stepped onto Lincoln Financial Field, the weight of an entire franchise rested on his shoulders. Philadelphia was known for its passion, but also for its intensity, a place where fans demanded results and patience was thin. Wentz knew it wouldn't be easy, but he embraced the challenge with an unwavering focus. As a rookie, Wentz surpassed all expectations. His intelligence on the field, combined with his athleticism, drew immediate comparisons to Andrew Luck. The kid from North Dakota was no longer a hidden gem, he was a rising star. Game after game, he dissected defenses with precision, showing poise far beyond his years. By the end of the season, the Eagles didn't just have hope, they had a future. But it was in 2017, his second year, that Wentz truly ascended to greatness. The Eagles started the season with a 5-1 record, and Wentz was playing at an MVP level. His cannon-like arm and his ability to escape pressure with athletic grace had defenses scrambling. He threw touchdown after touchdown, making magic happen on third downs, leading game-winning drives, and putting Philadelphia in prime position for a Super Bowl run. Wentz quickly became the NFL's darling, the man destined to lead the Eagles to their first championship in decades. National media couldn't get enough of him. Highlights of his insane throws, miraculous escapes, and fierce competitive spirit flooded TV screens every Sunday night. It felt like destiny. One game in particular cemented his growing legend. In a mid-season showdown against the Los Angeles Rams, Wentz was brilliant. He danced around the pocket, making impossible plays, and leading his team down the field with breathtaking precision. It seemed as though nothing could stop him, until it did. Late in the game, Wentz scrambled toward the end zone. As defenders closed in, he dove for the touchdown. His body twisted awkwardly as multiple Rams crashed into him, his knee buckling under the weight. Wentz got up, grimacing, but stayed in the game. He threw a touchdown pass on the very next play. The crowd roared, unaware of what had just happened beneath the surface. But Wentz knew. He could feel it, the telltale pop in his knee. He had torn his ACL. As he limped off the field, it wasn't just the physical pain that overwhelmed him, it was the realization that his season was over. His MVP caliber year, his shot at leading his team to the Super Bowl, it was all slipping away. Wentz sat on the sideline, helmet in hand, eyes glazed with disbelief. Around him, teammates tried to console him, but nothing could shake the sense of loss that now clung to the air. Despite his season-ending injury, the Eagles, led by backup Nick Foles, would go on to win the Super Bowl. It was a bittersweet victory for Wentz. He had led them there, but it was Foles who hoisted the Lombardi Trophy. In the locker room after the game, amidst the champagne and celebration, Wentz felt the sting of displacement. This was supposed to be his moment, his redemption story. Instead, it was someone else living out the dream he had fought so hard for. The media played up the narrative. Foles, the humble backup who stepped in and delivered when the city needed him most. Wentz, sidelined, could only watch as his teammates rallied around Foles in celebration. Whispers began to surface. Was Foles the true leader? Was Wentz replaceable? The injury was more than just physical. It was a fracture in the trust between Wentz and the city that had once adored him. But as he began his long recovery, he vowed to come back stronger. He would reclaim what was his. Yet, as he pushed his body through grueling rehab sessions, the road ahead became increasingly complicated. By the time Wentz returned for the 2018 season, something had changed. The once invincible quarterback was now hesitant, his movements cautious where they had once been bold. His physical form was healing, but mentally the scars ran deep. Foles was still a hero in Philadelphia, and it was impossible to escape the comparisons. As the Eagles struggled to regain their dominant form, the tension between Wentz and the team began to grow. Rumors swirled. Some of his teammates hinted at fractures in the locker room. Wentz, once seen as the golden boy, was now labeled as difficult, selfish even. His leadership style, once praised, was now questioned. Reports leaked of Wentz refusing to run certain plays, of favoring certain receivers while ignoring others. The whispers became louder. Maybe Wentz wasn't the leader Philadelphia needed after all. The tension was palpable. In private moments, Wentz couldn't understand how things had turned so quickly. He had been the star, the savior, and now it felt like the entire city had turned on him. His relationship with Foles was cordial, but behind the smiles, there was an unspoken rivalry. Who did the team truly belong to? Wentz, the franchise quarterback, or Foles, the man who delivered a Super Bowl? As Wentz continued to battle through the 2018 season, it became clear that his body wasn't fully healed. He pushed through injuries, unwilling to admit defeat, but his play on the field was inconsistent. His once brilliant decision-making faltered, turnovers increased, and each game felt like a battle to prove he was still worthy of the mantle that had been stripped from him. By the end of the season, the Eagles once again turned to Foles in the playoffs. Wentz watched from the sidelines, frustration gnawing at him. His locker room seemed divided, and the love he once felt from the city was now tainted by doubt. As the offseason approached, Wentz was left with a sinking feeling in his gut. His MVP potential was a distant memory, and the whispers about his leadership only grew louder. The same teammates who had once rallied around him now seemed distant, as if they were waiting for him to fail. But the worst was yet to come. The beginning of the end. By the start of the 2019 season, Carson Wentz's dream had soured. The Philadelphia Eagles were still his team, but the undercurrent of doubt had never fully disappeared. Nick Foles was gone, having signed with the Jacksonville Jaguars, leaving Wentz as the clear starter once again. But the echoes of Foles' Super Bowl triumph still haunted the locker room, and worse, the city. No matter what he did, Wentz was living in the shadow of a man who had led Philadelphia to its greatest victory. Determined to silence the critics and reclaim his position as the unquestioned leader, Wentz pushed harder than ever. He threw himself into the season with reckless abandon, desperate to show everyone he still had what it took. At times, flashes of his former brilliance returned. His arm strength was undeniable, and there were moments when his escapability and field vision reminded everyone of the player who had once been an MVP frontrunner. But those moments were fleeting. Wentz was no longer playing with the same fearlessness. His decision-making grew erratic, and his accuracy, once pinpoint, became inconsistent. Games that should have been easy wins turned into nail-biters as the Eagles struggled to find rhythm. And with each passing week, the media's scrutiny intensified. The locker room, too, seemed to be unraveling. Reports of friction between Wentz and his teammates continued to surface. Some players quietly hinted that Wentz was overly controlling, refusing to take advice or adjust his style of play. Others felt sidelined by his tendency to favor certain receivers over others. "He's not a team player," one source leaked to the press. "It's like he's playing for himself." The Eagles' season spiraled as the losses piled up. Wentz's frustration boiled over. On the field, he began forcing throws, trying to do too much, and the turnovers became a glaring issue. Off the field, he grew more isolated. The easygoing camaraderie he once shared with teammates had dissolved. In its place was a cold, tense atmosphere, with Wentz retreating into himself, convinced that no one truly had his back. Things reached a breaking point in a late-season game against the Seattle Seahawks. The Eagles, desperate for a win, were in the hunt for a wild-card playoff spot. But it was a disaster from the start. Wentz threw 2 interceptions in the first half, both of them ugly. One on a forced throw into double coverage, and the other on a miscommunication with his receiver. On the sidelines, Wentz's frustration was visible. He slammed his helmet down, yelling at no one in particular, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. Coaches tried to calm him, but it was clear that Wentz's confidence was shaken. When he returned to the field in the second half, the tension was palpable. Then the unthinkable happened. As Wentz dropped back to pass, the Seahawks' defensive line collapsed the pocket. Wentz scrambled, but he wasn't as quick as he used to be. A linebacker crashed into him from behind, driving him into the turf. Wentz didn't get up. The stadium fell silent as trainers rushed onto the field. It was his back, an injury that would sideline him for the remainder of the season. The Eagles limped into the playoffs with their third-string quarterback, but were quickly eliminated. As Wentz sat on the sidelines, watching yet another postseason without him, the question loomed. Was this the end of Carson Wentz as Philadelphia's franchise quarterback? The offseason brought no relief. Wentz spent months in rehab trying to get his body right, but something deeper was broken. The front office, once unwavering in its support of Wentz, began to hedge its bets. Rumors of trade discussions circulated, though nothing came of them. Teammates, too, seemed to be pulling away. While Wentz posted motivational messages on social media about his comeback, the locker room felt a growing disconnect. By the time the 2020 season arrived, Wentz was a shell of the quarterback who had once taken the NFL by storm. The Eagles, already dealing with injuries across the roster, struggled from the start. Wentz's play was erratic, moments of brilliance overshadowed by baffling decisions and costly mistakes. The turnovers piled up, fumbles, interceptions. Game after game, Wentz seemed to be unraveling. It all came to a head in Week 13. The Eagles were playing the Green Bay Packers, and Wentz was once again struggling. His throws were off target, and the offense couldn't move the ball. The boos from the Philadelphia crowd grew louder with every failed drive. And then, halfway through the third quarter, the moment came that would define Wentz's downfall. Head coach Doug Peterson made the call. Wentz was benched. Rookie Jalen Hurts was sent into the game, and the crowd erupted in cheers. The message was clear: Philadelphia had moved on. As Hurts led the team down the field, energizing the offense with his mobility and poise, Wentz sat on the sideline, staring blankly into the distance. His career in Philadelphia was over, and he knew it. In the weeks that followed, the Eagles announced that Hurts would remain the starter. Wentz, once hailed as the franchise savior, was now a backup. The whispers that had followed him for years were no longer whispers, they were shouts. The media tore into him, calling him selfish, fragile, unable to handle the pressure. Teammates, too, began to speak more openly about the fractures in the locker room. One anonymous player summed it up: "We were tired of the drama. We were tired of him." Wentz's time in Philadelphia came to a quiet, unceremonious end. In the offseason, the Eagles traded him to the Indianapolis Colts for a package of draft picks, cutting their losses and moving forward with Hurts. Philadelphia, a city that had once embraced Wentz as their hero, was now ready to forget him. In Indianapolis, Wentz saw it as a chance for redemption. Reunited with Frank Reich, his former offensive coordinator who had helped him achieve MVP-level play, Wentz hoped for a fresh start. The Colts had a strong roster and high expectations. This was supposed to be his comeback, the chapter where he proved the doubters wrong. But the ghosts of his past followed him. The fall from grace. Carson Wentz arrived in Indianapolis with the weight of redemption on his shoulders. The Colts, eager to reclaim their status as playoff contenders, believed they had found their missing piece in Wentz. It seemed like the perfect situation: a fresh start, away from the harsh spotlight of Philadelphia, reunited with Frank Reich, the coach who had once unlocked his potential. The expectations were high, but Wentz was no stranger to pressure. The narrative was set. This was his second chance to prove that he still had what it took to lead a team to glory. But the optimism didn't last long. Almost immediately, Wentz's health became a concern again. During the preseason, he suffered a foot injury that required surgery, sidelining him before he even took a snap. Though he worked tirelessly to recover in time for the start of the regular season, the injury cast an early shadow over his time in Indianapolis. And even when he returned, something was different. The old Carson Wentz, the one who had made jaw-dropping plays with effortless ease, was gone. In his place was a quarterback haunted by hesitation. As the 2021 season progressed, Wentz had flashes of his former brilliance. There were games where he played like the star he once was, threading passes through tight windows, leading the Colts to victory with precision and poise. But just as quickly, the mistakes would return. Turnovers at crucial moments, interceptions, fumbles, began to define his season. His decision-making, which had been a hallmark of his early success, faltered under pressure. And with each mistake, the confidence that the Colts had placed in him began to erode. It wasn't just the physical side of the game that Wentz struggled with. The whispers about his leadership, which had plagued him in Philadelphia, followed him to Indianapolis. While publicly the team supported him, behind the scenes cracks began to form. Some teammates quietly questioned his commitment. His reluctance to get vaccinated against COVID-19, despite the NFL's stringent protocols, became a point of contention within the locker room. It wasn't just about football anymore. Wentz's decisions off the field were impacting the team on it. As the season reached its critical stretch, the Colts were in the playoff hunt. They needed Wentz to be at his best, but he continued to be a model of inconsistency. One week, he would deliver a game-winning performance, showing flashes of the quarterback that once had been an MVP frontrunner. The next, he would implode, making decisions that left fans and coaches alike scratching their heads. The mounting pressure seemed to get to him, as if the weight of expectation had become too heavy to bear. The turning point came in Week 18, the final game of the regular season. The Colts needed a win against the Jacksonville Jaguars, an already eliminated team with little to play for, to secure a playoff spot. It was supposed to be a straightforward victory, the kind of game a team with championship aspirations wins without a second thought. But from the start, things went wrong. Wentz looked off. His passes were inaccurate, his pocket presence shaky. The Jaguars' defense, motivated by nothing but pride, harassed him all game, and Wentz responded with one of the worst performances of his career. He threw 2 interceptions and fumbled once, the turnovers killing any momentum the Colts tried to build. The offense sputtered and stalled, and Wentz's body language told the story. He was rattled, unsure of himself in the biggest moment of the season. The Jaguars, with nothing on the line, played like the hungrier team, and when the final whistle blew, the scoreboard told a story no one in Indianapolis wanted to believe. The Colts had lost. Their season was over. The aftermath was brutal. The media shredded Wentz for his performance, questioning whether he could ever be the franchise quarterback the Colts thought they were getting. But the worst blow came from within the organization. Colts owner Jim Irsay, visibly frustrated in interviews, refused to offer a vote of confidence for Wentz's future with the team. Behind the scenes, the Colts front office began discussing their options. They had given up valuable draft picks to acquire Wentz, but after just one season, it was clear he wasn't the answer. Wentz, for his part, was devastated. He had come to Indianapolis seeking redemption, but all he had found was more doubt, more questions about his ability to lead a team when it mattered most. In the quiet moments after the loss, sitting in the locker room, Wentz couldn't escape the sinking feeling that the narrative of his career was slipping further and further out of his control. He had been so close. One game away from the playoffs, one game away from turning the story around. But once again he had fallen short. The offseason came, and with it the rumors of a trade. The Colts, unwilling to commit to Wentz for another season, began quietly shopping him around the league. Wentz, who had once been seen as the future of the NFL, was now considered damaged goods. Teams were hesitant. His reputation as a talented but unreliable quarterback, plagued by injuries, turnovers, and leadership concerns, made him a risky bet. But then the Washington Commanders called. The trade came quickly, and with it, Wentz found himself on his third team in as many years. Washington, a franchise desperate for stability at quarterback, was willing to take a chance on him. For Wentz, it was another opportunity, a fresh start, one more chance to prove that he wasn't the bust so many had started to believe he was. As he walked into the Commanders' facility for the first time, Wentz couldn't help but feel the familiar sting of doubt. The weight of his failures in Philadelphia and Indianapolis followed him like a shadow, and while he tried to remain optimistic, there was a part of him that couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this might be his last shot. The 2022 season was a disaster from the start. Injuries once again plagued Wentz, sidelining him for weeks. When he did play, the same issues that had haunted him in Indianapolis resurfaced. Poor decision-making, turnovers, and an inability to elevate the players around him. By mid-season, Washington had seen enough. Wentz was benched, replaced by backup Taylor Heinicke, whose gritty play and leadership endeared him to both the locker room and the fans. For the second time in his career, Wentz had been replaced by a backup who seemed to embody everything he couldn't. Heinicke wasn't the most talented quarterback, but he played with heart, something that Wentz's teammates and coaches couldn't help but admire. The team rallied around Heinicke, and Wentz was once again left on the sidelines, watching as another quarterback took what was supposed to be his. When the season ended, the Commanders released Wentz. No fanfare, no dramatic farewell, just the quiet, unceremonious end of his time in Washington. By the time the 2023 season rolled around, Wentz found himself unsigned. A quarterback who had once been the second overall pick, who had once been the face of a franchise, was now without a team. Eventually, the Los Angeles Rams offered him a backup role, and later the Kansas City Chiefs did the same. But it was clear, Wentz's days as a starting quarterback were over. His fall from grace was complete. As Wentz stood on the sidelines watching younger, hungrier quarterbacks take the field, he couldn't help but reflect on what had gone wrong. Injuries had taken their toll, yes, but there was more to it than that. Leadership, adaptability, resilience, these were the qualities that defined the great quarterbacks, and somewhere along the way Wentz had lost them. The Carson Wentz that had once electrified the NFL with his talent and potential was now a distant memory. In his place was a man still searching for redemption, still hoping for one more chance to rewrite the story of his career. But deep down, Wentz knew that chance might never come. The last stand in silence. Carson Wentz sat alone in his Kansas City apartment, staring blankly at the television screen. It was mid-2023 and the Chiefs were deep in their playoff run. The roar of the stadium crowd blared through the speakers as Patrick Mahomes, the NFL's golden boy, led the team with the ease and confidence Wentz once knew all too well. His phone buzzed with notifications. Articles, stats, social media posts, all about Mahomes. Wentz ignored them, his mind drifting back to the days when that could have been him. The living room was dimly lit, casting long shadows across the floor. A stack of unopened letters sat on the coffee table. Endorsement offers, invitations to charity events, and fan mail from the few who still believed in him. But even those voices of support felt distant, hollow. For months, Wentz had tried to convince himself that he was just waiting for the right moment, that his comeback was inevitable. But the truth weighed heavily on him now. He was no longer a star. He wasn't even a starter. The rise, the fall, the benchings, the trades, it all felt like a blur, like a career that had slipped through his fingers faster than he could grasp it. He had been on top of the world once, hailed as the savior of Philadelphia. But now, just 7 years later, he was a backup, sitting on the sidelines as the world moved on without him. No one expected anything from him anymore, and that realization cut deeper than any injury ever could. He thought about his days in North Dakota, the quiet fields where football was more of a dream than a profession. Back then it had been pure. No noise, no pressure, just the game. He missed that. But the NFL wasn't about purity. It was about survival. And he hadn't survived. As the game on TV reached a commercial break, Wentz leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. Flashes of his career played in his mind like a cruel highlight reel. The 2017 season, the dive into the end zone against the Rams, the ACL tear that had changed everything. The confetti falling as the Eagles won the Super Bowl without him, the cheers for Nick Foles as he hoisted the Lombardi Trophy, while Wentz watched from the shadows. The locker room rumors, the criticism, the back and forth between brilliance and mediocrity, and the endless questions about his leadership. He tried to shake it off, but the thoughts kept coming like a dam had broken. The bitterness lingered. How had it all gone so wrong? He had worked harder than anyone, endured the pain, pushed through the doubts. But in the end it hadn't been enough. And now, as he sat in a city where the quarterback position was locked down by a living legend, Wentz knew that his time was running out. He was 30, but his body felt much older, worn down from years of hits and injuries. The mental toll, too, had been brutal. It was late and the playoff game had ended. Kansas City had won again, and Wentz could hear the distant sounds of fireworks outside his apartment window. The city was alive with celebration, but Wentz felt none of it. Instead, he picked up his phone and opened a message thread from his agent. The last message was from 2 days ago, a simple update, telling Wentz that no teams were calling, no offers were coming. He tossed the phone aside and stood up, pacing the room. His heart raced, anger and frustration bubbling to the surface. He had been one of the best quarterbacks in the league. How had he ended up like this? He thought of the Eagles, of Indianapolis, of Washington. Each place he had been given the keys, the chance to lead, and each time something had gone wrong. But why? Was it the injuries? The locker room tension? Or something deeper? Suddenly he found himself reaching for his car keys. He didn't know where he was going, but sitting here in this apartment, surrounded by reminders of what he had lost, was suffocating. The cold Kansas City air hit him as he stepped outside, his breath visible in the night. He drove aimlessly, the city lights flickering past his window, his mind still racing. After an hour, he found himself at Arrowhead Stadium. The massive structure loomed over him as he parked in the empty lot. It was quiet now, but just hours ago, this place had been deafening, filled with the cheers of fans celebrating their team's victory. Wentz stared at the stadium, wondering what it would have been like to lead a team in a place like this, to have the unwavering support of a city behind you. He thought back to Philadelphia, the roar of the crowd when he took the field, the belief they had in him, until they didn't. The cold reality was that no one cared about what could have been. In the NFL, you were only as good as your last game, your last season. And Wentz's last seasons had left much to be desired. A deep sense of loneliness washed over him. The kind of loneliness that comes not from being physically alone, but from knowing that your purpose, your identity, had been stripped away. Football had been his life, and now it was slipping from his grasp, leaving behind only questions and regrets. As he sat in his car, staring at the dark stadium, he thought about what came next. Could he keep doing this? Bouncing from team to team, a backup to younger quarterbacks who represented everything he used to be, full of promise with their best days ahead of them? Or was it time to walk away? Time to accept that his career, once filled with so much hope, had come to an end? Wentz sighed, leaning his head back against the seat. He could still hear the echoes of fans, of broadcasters praising his name, of teammates slapping his back in celebration after a big play. But those echoes were faint now, distant memories from a life that felt more like a dream than reality. The morning light began to creep over the horizon. Carson Wentz looked at the stadium one last time before starting the car. As he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that something inside him had shifted. Maybe this was it. Maybe it was time to let go. But even as he thought that, a small, stubborn part of him refused to accept it. That same part that had pushed him to rehab his injuries, to fight for his place on the field, to prove everyone wrong, it still flickered within him, no matter how faint. He had one more fight left. Whether it was in football or in life, Carson Wentz wasn't done just yet. But for now, the only certainty was that the road ahead would be different. His days as the face of a franchise were over. The cheers had faded, the spotlight had dimmed, and what remained was a man, no longer a star, searching for what came next. And in the silence of that Kansas City morning, Wentz finally realized, maybe that was okay.